In 1984, Warner sold off Atari, and the American computer games industry was declared dead. But elsewhere, innovation was still thriving, and a new breed of brilliant game designers and entrepreneurs was about to emerge.
It started as a hobby, and yes, it turned into obsession, turned into a career, I guess.
Twins Philip and Andrew Oliver were typical British teenagers. Their parents didn't allow them to have a television game console, but computers were considered educational. And a whole series of cheap personal computers like the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 came on the market. Thousands of well-intentioned parents bought them, and in doing so, spawned a software industry that now rivals any in the world. In the early 1980s, in classrooms, playgrounds, and bedrooms throughout Britain, teenagers were plotting a revolution. Some of them were about to become millionaires. Aged just 12, the Oliver twins aspired to make games which offered something different to the classic arcade games.
The leading edge was what was happening in the arcades. But the problem with arcades was they had to kind of take your 10p or 20p and give you only 1 minute's worth of fun. Whereas the computer games...
Kids can play it all evening, every evening if they want.
The Oliver twins taught themselves how to program games on their new computers. In 1982, when they were just 13, they published their first game, Roadrunner. The program for it was published in a magazine so that readers could type it into their own computers.
It was just so cool to be able to sort of go into school and say, look, that's our work, and just like run through it with kind of other kids.
It was just blocks of single colours. It kind of raced up the screen and the track moved down the screen. And we used to challenge each other, how long can you last? It slowly got narrower and narrower and twistier with good random in there. So it'd eventually knock you off.
The magazine paid them a token fee for the game. They entered their next game into a designer game competition for a kids' TV show.
We wrote a game, sent it in, and we won first prize, and we appeared on television. And that was kind of great, but it was so funny because they said afterwards, we were the only one that actually sent in a game. They didn't actually mean for people to write games. They wanted you to design on paper, wouldn't it be cool if a character did this and this, whereas we'd actually written a game.
Their hobby was quickly turning into a cottage industry, based in their bedroom at home.
We did a whole series of games here.
First few.
There's this Killer P
and KV. There were many times where you just worked straight through the night and you had school in the morning, and we just sort of like break up, like you're going to do all the arrows shooting and boulders dropping, and you're going to do this, and you'd go to sleep and you'd wake up and it's like, oh cool, there's a new feature in the game. We just keep working and working and working, and we were starting to get suspicious when you had birds tweeting at the window and it was getting brighter outside.
You can hear the milk float.
Yeah.
Publishers distributed their games all over the country and sold them in high street stores. But by the time they were finishing school, the twins were still being paid very little, and their parents thought it was time they got a real career. But one of their teachers at school persuaded their parents to give them 1 year to make a go of it. And a few weeks later, everything changed when they met the Darling brothers. The Darling brothers had also been programming their own games since their early teens. But they were unhappy with the token amounts of money that game companies were offering teenage designers. So they sold their games by mail order, setting up their own company in a spare room at home. They duplicated their games on cassette, printed their own artwork, and eventually sold 1 million copies. In 1985, they set up their own publishing company, Codemasters. And at their first trade show, they met the 18-year-old Oliver twins.
The Oliver twins came in and we sat down and they showed us a demo of one of the games they'd done previously.
They're going, a game like that, yeah, we'll give you £10,000 for it.
We were just staggered.
If they've said that they were their jaws hit the floor and they were very excited. They must have concealed that quite well.
We couldn't get home fast enough, and we just didn't sleep. Within about a month, we wrote Super Robin Hood, which went straight to #1. By Christmas, we'd sold 100,000 units and made £10,000, and in fact, it carried on selling, so we actually made a little bit more. Just couldn't believe it. But of course, the minute it started selling, we just couldn't stop, so we just started rattling out more games for Codemasters.
It was one of the most successful partnerships in computer game history.
We worked out that 50% of all Codemaster games were actually written by us.
The Oliver twins were also working on a secret project. They wanted to do something new, a game centred on an animated cartoon character. And that character was Dizzy.
We wanted like this fantasy world.
I had this idea. We should get the character's face as big as possible on screen to give it a bit of personality.
They got an awful lot of fan mail in at Codemasters all about it and asking how do you do this and how do you do that, and every time we went up they go, oh, we got some more fan mail.
Dizzy was an international hit. The game's topped bestsellers charts all around the world.
One stage we had different Dizzy games at number 1, 2, 3 in the charts, which is a bit like the Beatles of the games industry.
The Oliver twins story was repeated all over the country. Teenage computer game millionaires became national celebrities. The newspapers were full of stories of young whiz kids buying houses, speedboats and sports cars that they weren't even old enough to drive. The result of all this hard labour was a massive creative contribution to game design. These were games designed by gamers for gamers. Thanks to the home computer era, Britain now contributes more game designers and programmers to the games industry than any other country.
I remember saying to a journalist, it's like, one day, this will be bigger than TV. I mean, right now, the UK games industry actually has bigger export than the British film and TV put together.
But back in the early 80s, while British teenagers were the stars of the home computer era, new stars were also rising in the East. The centre of the computer industry was soon to shift again, to Japan. Today, the computer games industry that began 30 years ago with Atari on the west coast of America is now dominated by Japan. And it's largely thanks to an extraordinary series of character-based games. Donkey Kong, Mario and Zelda, all developed in the 80s by a single creative